Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to our first recorded program, Afternoon Doodlings. My name is Lynne. I work for the San Mateo County Libraries. If you recognize my face, you may have seen me at the Belmont branch, or you may have seen some of the art streams that I did last week. And today I am joined by...
Hi, everyone. My name is Debbie Huey. I work at
Hello.
the Millbrae Library. So yeah, thank you for joining us to watch Lynne draw in her afternoon doodlings.
Yeah, welcome. So I have a bit of a lesson queued up today, which is going to essentially go over how to take a reference picture, how to read certain shapes and distances out of that picture, and how to start using that information to begin creating your own poses that may not be what your picture actually specifically shows. So I'm going to go ahead and connect my iPad in order to share my screen in 3, 2, 1. There we go. So I will be using digital art today, but that's primarily for the ease of being able to show you all what I am drawing. So you should not feel limited by anything that I'm using today in order to take that information and apply it to your own drawings. So as you can see, I have pulled a selection of bunny friends for our reference today.
Cute bunnies.
Yeah, they're so cute. That's part of why I chose them. They're going to be very easy shapes to go through and recreate because they're just a bunch of circles of varying exaggerations. So on that note, the very first step that we are going to take today is we are actually going to trace over our bunny pictures so that we can start finding shapes within them. So like I said, I am using digital art today, but that is not something that should prevent you from being able to do the same thing with the tools you have. If you have the ability to print pictures, that is a fantastic substitute. Or alternatively, if you have a very sturdy setup that can handle it, you can sometimes even hold a piece of paper up to your computer or whatever you're using, and you can just sketch right on top of that, because what we're going to be doing is very loose, very sketchy anyway. It does not need to be anything that's shiny or perfect. So the very first thing I'm going to start doing is I am going to map out some of the shapes that I see in our bunny friend here today. So for instance, the head is something of an egg shape. The ears are nice, elongated ovals, and this is something that I just continue all the way down throughout the body. So the main body itself can also be read as a nice round oval. The tail is a nice little tuft at the end. And the legs can each actually be broken into essentially 2 key parts. So the back leg, when we follow it along the curve of the body, and we can see the limb here, that sort of main joint with the knee where it really gets its jumping power is a nice large circle of its own, while the foot is a much longer little oval connected right at the bottom. And meanwhile, the front legs, you can actually sort of see as being a little bit of a triangular shape capped off with a nice little circle foot. And there's lots of other little details that if we wanted to, we could dive into studying, mapping out how certain parts line up with each other, what is the key distance between certain features so that when we translate it into our own drawing, the proportions stay consistent. But in this case, I am going to pretty much stick with these core shapes that I just observed, and I'm going to go ahead, find a little blank part of my canvas, and I'm going to now freehand those shapes.
A lot of ovals.
Yes. Bunnies are nice and satisfyingly round. They're very friend-shaped. So in this case, we have kind of the eggs circle for the head. We have the nice big round oval for the body. We can do our back legs with big circle followed by long circle. We can do the front legs with kind of the triangle followed by little circle. We can have the two ears as the nice long ovals. We can add the little extra circle tuft of the tail. And just like that, even though these are very, very basic shapes, we can start to see how this is the foundation of what makes up a rabbit. And from there, this is something that you can add as much or as little detail as you want in. You can start to erase things. You can start to correct things. So for instance, when we're really looking at the bunny, we can see how even the body itself, while the body itself generally makes up an oval, it does curve up slightly right in the belly. That's something we could translate into our own drawing. But the interesting thing is that even with this very minimal amount of detail, we can see that we have made a friendly little bunny rabbit.
It's so friendly.
Yeah. Gonna solidify some of these lines a little bit just for my own satisfaction. My personal go-to way of drawing things is just to draw a bunch of lines until I see one that looks more or less correct, and then I erase away down to it. It's a very handy trick to pretend that your final product is much cleaner than it ever started.
It is a good tip. I do the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, never be afraid of things looking sketchy.
Mm-hmm.
But, so what we just did right there is the essentially first two basic steps in learning how to use reference material. You trace over top the picture so that you can gain as much information out of that picture as you can, and then you move into directly copying it so that you can get a more solid sense of those shapes that you observed and how it really feels to do on your own. However, you may sometimes find that what you want to draw is not in any of the pictures that you've looked up. So for instance, the bunnies that I have chosen today are all pretty static images. They're all just kind of chilling out. They're sitting, they're lounging. They're not really doing much action. And maybe what you really wanted to draw was a bunny in motion. So the cool thing is that even though these pictures don't show a bunny jumping, they still give us enough information that we can start creating our own poses. So let's move up to this guy up here. Kind of the same thing with our first bunny friend. As we trace over it, we can start to see certain commonalities in terms of the shapes that we can observe. So the body is still a nice oval, the head is still that kind of egg, long ovals for ears, two separate parts for the legs, nice little tuft of the tail. And the more pictures that you are able to observe these sort of details across, the more you will start to uncover certain patterns in terms of both what shapes stay consistent and how they line up with themselves. So this in turn allows us then to start playing with the order in which we put those shapes down on the paper or the page that we're drawing on, and we can start to manipulate them almost in order to create new poses. All that really matters is that the key parts we observe that are connected together stay connected together. So for instance, looking at this picture here, we can draw a very quick shape study of a rabbit sitting down, but we can also kind of infer that if we wanted to draw a rabbit jumping, we draw the head, we draw the body, connect to the head, we draw our feet in two parts, still connected together, We draw our ears, and we have now successfully created a new pose that is using the exact same shapes that we first saw when we were looking at that initial picture. And it's very sketchy, obviously, but it's still quite readable as being a rabbit. And so this is where you can start having fun, because this gives you the freedom to then take those same basic shapes. I think there's about 8 in total, like 1 for the head, 1 for the ears, 1 for the body, 2 parts per leg and tail. And you can start essentially putting them in whatever order you want in order to create new poses. So what's a pose you might want to try, Debbie?
What about when the one it's ready to pounce? It's in the right before it's about to hop really far.
Ooh, that's a good one. So in that case, let's say we have circle for the head. It's going to be a little hunched over, so the head might be closer in on the body, but we still have that circle for the body. We got 1 circle for the leg, 1 for the foot. Same with the other ones, and they might all be kind of squished in on each other because it's curling in on itself. It's getting ready. Nice little tail. And let's maybe have its ears flopping back. Maybe it's already mid-motion, but it's getting ready for the next bounce. And so, just like that, using those same shapes, but putting them in a slightly different order, but still with the same connections and proportions, we have now drawn a bunny that is essentially right in the middle of running, prepared to go into its next jump.
And I almost see like an animation going on where with your 3 drawings there, I can see the progression of it hopping. It's like a comic.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's one of the fun things about drawing comics specifically, is that you are finding ways to sort of imitate motion through completely static images. So I have a example of that I'll go into a little later. I'm going to draw a few more poses first. Cool. Because the pose you suggested, Debbie, is one that a rabbit would absolutely be doing in real life. But one of the fun things about when you find the consistent shapes that make up the thing you're drawing, you can start to exaggerate them into things that you wouldn't necessarily see in real life. So for instance, you probably aren't going to see a bunny doing some kind of like big old kickboxing thing. But when you know the shapes that basically make up that rabbit, and you keep them consistent with themselves, you can draw a bunny that's doing a nice little high kick into the air. Or maybe you want to draw a bunny that's saying hi. Like, they're probably not going to like raise one of their paws and wave at you. But when you're using these same shapes that you initially observed in the real life rabbit, and you're just kind of keeping consistent in how they each connect with each other, you can now draw little bunnies waving or kicking or whatever you want them to be doing, and they're all still fundamentally readable as rabbits.
It's amazing how just those simple lines can really just translate into an instant image.
Yeah, it really doesn't take a lot, which is why you have a huge amount of freedom in terms of how much or how little detail you want to put in. It really boils down to what parts of the drawing are you having fun with. So all of these little sketches are obviously very simple, very quick, very sketchy, but they also make really great warm-up drawings because they keep you nice and loose, and they can very easily become the foundation of maybe a much more in-depth and cleaner drawing that you want to make. So I touched on it very briefly a couple minutes ago, but one of the fun things about drawing is trying to imitate motion through a completely static object. And one of the key principles in terms of imitating that is the concept of squash and stretch. So unless you are dealing with a very, very stiff object, like say a piece of wood or something, most things have a certain degree of flexibility to them. So for instance, if you were to take a rubber ball and you were just to slam it down on the ground as hard as you can, if you were to observe that motion, like if you were to observe that in slow motion, you may notice that as it's being thrown down, the ball stretches out because of the force at which it was thrown. And when it hits the ground, it's gonna squish as it lands. So even though it started out as a circle, its shape changes with the motion that it is taking. And so that is a principle that we can in turn apply to some of the poses that we're making if we want to give them more of a sense of motion. So for instance, let's say we want to draw a bunny that's really, really just like squished on itself, hunched up. So while we may normally observe the body as being generally pretty oval-like, in this case, we might draw it as a complete circle. We add the head on top. We add two-part legs, all just sort of like scrunched in on itself. We add the ears. In this case, we might not even see the tail. And you got a very squished up, round little bunny. Now,
I want to hug it.
Side,
I want to hug it.
It's a very huggable bunny. Now, on the flip side, however, maybe you want to draw a bunny that is leaping through the air. So instead of taking your oval and squishing it into a circle, what you may instead do is stretch that oval out. And then you apply that to each sort of basic shape that makes up the other limbs. So maybe the head's stretched forward more, the legs, the two parts are all stretched out, forward, stretched forward, the ears are going like way back. And now we have a sense of the bunny leaping forward. And once again, this kind of demonstrates that as long as you're putting these basic shapes down in the same basic order on top of themselves, even though we are radically changing what those shapes look like, both of these are still basically readable as a rabbit. And that can start to give you a lot of freedom in terms of doing like really fun dynamic poses, because they can give this sense of movement, either of a bunny coming to like a complete halt or of a bunny just leaping forward, just having at it. So one other thing that you may run into when you are trying to draw, in this case, your bunny friends, may be that you want to draw the pose at a different angle than what it's at, whether it's you're moving from a profile to a front-facing shot, or maybe you're trying to do it from a completely different perspective altogether, like a top-down. So in that case, we can once again start off by playing with the basic shapes that we have, and especially in this case, we can start playing with understanding the distance between key features, because that distance is going to be what makes it so even when the shapes start landing on top of each other in completely different ways, we can still see how it's a rabbit because we can see that the proportions within it are still staying the same. So let's say we only had a bunny as an example from a profile picture. If we wanted to start to rotate it around, we might go from having its facial features mapped out from the side. So let's pretend like its ears are here, its eyes are here. You would start moving it along with your guidelines so that now this is the front part of the face. And maybe we continue it further. We move our guidelines one more time. We put the key features like the eyes and the nose in the same place. We have the ears line up along with it. And you now get a sense of how the head might turn within a sort of three-dimensional space. I keep finding little dots on here that I didn't mean to make. And that's something that we can then continue. For instance, if we wanted to do our like super fancy top-down shot. So we know the head is a circle. When we mark out our little guidelines, we can extrapolate. The nose goes here, the eyes go here, the ears go here. And then that head circle lines up on top of the body circle. We still have the legs. We have the little tail. And we get a sense of a rabbit that we, the viewer, are looking down at. So it's once again the exact same shapes that we observed for the very first time in these pictures of the rabbits, but we now have the freedom to shift them around as much as we want in order to create something entirely new as a brand new pose.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So, you know how you have like all your different guiding shapes, your 8 shapes that you have for the bunny? Mm-hmm. How do you decide like which shapes are completely essential to a drawing when you're you know, how do I explain this? Like you can get as detailed as you want with your reference mm-hmm. drawing, but how do you determine which shapes are like your basic shapes that you're going to use to make whatever you're trying to draw?
That is a very good question. My personal go-to means it's one part already having a sort of art style that I like to do. I like to do cartoony round shapes, so I tend to look for cartoony round shapes. And it's one part, especially when you have the ability to reference directly, either if you're tracing over it, if you're just looking at it, to try and get a sense of how does your hand move when you are following the basic outline of something. Because once you get a handle on that, if you take your reference picture away and you're just left with these lines, you can often start to see the shapes that are left underneath them. So for instance, in this case, I'm following these outlines and I can kind of see that even though this back part here doesn't connect, if I were to connect it, it makes a pretty perfect circle. And kind of similarly, you can see this especially with the legs where I'm reading things in. So for instance, based on the shadows, you can see that the bunny has a limb right around here. Like that's essentially its leg area. And that in turn, if you sort of just connect the lines, you find yourself left with these two sort of fundamental shapes that you can then start to layer on top of each other however you want in order to put them in whatever pose you want.
It seems like you're really thinking about like even the bone structure that's underneath all that fur in the bunny, mm-hmm. and trying to figure out where its legs are and whatnot, even though you might not be able to see it exactly.
Yeah, and so that's one of the big benefits as well of getting multiple reference pictures, especially if you're just trying to learn something at a conceptual level. Because if this little black bunny here was our only example, because of its super dark fur, those lines are very easily lost within it, and we may have a harder time telling what is happening with the leg, whereas, yeah, this guy with the lighter fur, you would have an easier time seeing that there is a very clear bend in what its body is doing. So yeah, if you have the time and effort to really go into bone structure, that's especially really, really useful actually if you're doing realism, because you will get a much stronger sense of what the unnegotiable proportions of the thing you're drawing are. But in this particular case, I like doing cartoony style, so even though I'm thinking about what its limbs are, I'm translating them into just very simple, very easily recreated shapes that you can just layer on top of each other and get an immediate picture of, it's not real, but it's clearly a rabbit. Yeah, and a lot of deciding what details to add in and what elements to focus on boils down to being kind of a personal situation, where the more you draw, the more you will start to uncover your own patterns in your art, what you like to draw, and equally importantly, what you don't like to draw. Both of these are equally valid with each other. Because, for instance, as you can kind of tell based on these sketches, I like doing line art the most. I like thinking about the shapes. I like thinking about how they line up with each other and how I can convey that motion with the direction and the shape of my lines. Whereas on the flip side, when it comes to like the nitty-gritty details of like, how does the fur look? I just don't put as much time into that. But for other people, that may be where they find the most joy in what they're doing. What they may really like doing is looking at their reference pictures and really breaking down, like, how does the color of the fur gradiate across it? How does the shading work? Which parts of it are darker versus which ones are lighter? So it really comes down to asking yourself, what kind of art do you want to make? And what parts of that art do you enjoy the most in making? Or, like I said, what do you have like the least interest in doing? Because there is an artist that I follow who once sort of explained that your art style is effectively the shortcuts that you take. So, for instance, let's say you're drawing a fantasy bunny comic, but you just are not about detailing that armor out. So you leave it very, very simplified. And that in turn, a little bit of a doofy face, but that's okay. That in turn becomes a fundamental part of your style, the fact that you leave this simplified. Or on the flip side, maybe you want to take this fantasy concept, but you really want to ground in reality, and so you put a lot of time and effort into the shading, but focus a little less on like the squash and stretch of the shapes. So it really all boils down to, what do you like to do, and also sort of understanding how simple can we go with this thing still being readable, and how do we escalate it from there if we so choose. Because in the case of bunnies, for instance, all you really need are the ears. And you now know that is a bunny.
That's a bunny.
All right, do you have any other thoughts or questions, Debbie?
I don't think so. I just really always enjoy watching you draw all the different. You're really good at drawing that top-down perspective. That's a real difficult.
It can be a tricky one. The fact that
yes.
keeping it sketchy makes it seem more plausible that it's actually anatomically correct than it probably really is.
I got to practice that. That's something I should do.
Yeah, well, if you know the shapes of what you're drawing, that oftentimes helps, because you know you're using the same core foundation for every single drawing, and that starts to give you freedom of, how much can I stretch this and still have it count?
That's cool. I'll definitely have to keep that in mind next time I'm trying to draw top down.
I'll be excited to see.
Yes.
All right, and I think that should be just about long enough for our program today. So thank you everyone who took the time to watch. If depending on when this goes up, we have lots more live programming that we will be hosting throughout the week. We have story times every single day. Debbie and I have a couple more art programs lined up Wednesday at 2 and Thursday at 4. And we are always open at our website at smcl.org. That is the best place to keep up to date with all the fun, cool, new things that we are doing. And also, if you have not yet finished your census, there is still time. It's very quick. It's very easy. And we are still taking responses to it. It's a very important thing. It's a very important kind of information for us to gather in terms of being properly represented. But I think that brings us to the end. So thank you once again, and I hope to see you guys again soon.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.